Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel, an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. Today, my guest is historian Jaipreet Virdi, an assistant professor of history at the University of Delaware. And we'll be talking about her recent book, which has gotten a lot of attention, Hearing Happiness, Deafness Cures in History. Jay, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Hearing Happiness it's such a great book. When you talk about it with strangers, which you've been doing a lot recently, how do you how do you explain what the book's about and what you were trying to do with it?
One way I like to promote my book, especially to non-academics, is I refer to Hearing Happiness as my coming out story as a deaf woman, and use that to pivot into explaining how, I struggled pretty much my whole life trying to suppress my deafness, trying to pass as hearing, but also as someone who relied very much on hearing aids and other kinds of communication accommodation, whether it is sitting up in the front seat of my classroom so I can lip read the teacher, or wearing an FM system, or trying not to wear an FM system when I was a kid. But I like to position that as the narrative of the book going forward, because I think people can connect to it on a much more intimate level. Like, this is not just a history that's been regulated in the past, but has issues that still very much influence people's lives today. So it's also a book I wrote when I was dealing with my own struggles with shifting the hearing aid types that I was wearing. So I wore analog hearing aids my whole life, which, for those of you who don't know, it basically just amplifies sound in your surrounding environment. But by the time I was in like my early 30s, my audiologist tells me that there's no company anymore that could repair my analog hearing aids if they broke, and my own maintenance of them wasn't good enough. Like, there comes to a point when you need professional service, right?
Yeah.
So they're telling me that, oh, hey, all the major hearing aid companies have completely shifted to digital, and that I was their last client who resisted digital hearing aids for 10 years. So I was the only one left who hadn't made that shift. And then, so I had no choice but to get digital hearing aids. And it was a 2-3 year process of struggling to relearn things, and also coming to terms with my grief in losing certain skills I had, like being able to hear on the telephone. And I'm dealing with a personal crisis and thinking about what it means for me to communicate with people, and what it means for me to identify myself, or not, as a deaf person. And then, I'm in the archive and I am reading all these people's letters where they are talking about their experiences of living as a deaf person and all the different choices in which they are selecting, medical cures, or buying a patent medicine product, or even asking an expert which hearing device best works for them. And I see myself so much in these historical actors. And eventually, I thought, I can write a history of Deafness Cures without talking about myself too, because I am part of this history. So that's kind of how Hearing Happiness emerged the way it did.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, I love the personal dimension of the book. It's just so great. I mean, there's another personal dimension too, isn't that, it came out of your career as a historian, where you were part of it is that you were writing this blog, right, from the hands of Quacks for a long time. So how is the book related to that project?
From the hands of Quacks was just a space on the internet for me to talk about my struggle as being a PhD academic, and how I was still navigating what it means to be a student, how it means to be doing history, because I actually did my undergrad in philosophy of science, so I was really having a hard time shifting to history. But what ended up happening over the years, blogging for this website, I ended up having two different types of audiences that didn't always interact. The first was the academic history of science the academic history of science community of bloggers and readers. some of whom, were connecting with each other over blogging and arguing that it was also a legitimate form of scholarship. This is like years ago when people were like looking down on blogging and not really taking Twitter seriously as an academic tool. So this was years ago. But I had their wonderful group of community, but with them, I was talking about archive struggle and some of the more historiographical debates I was working through. But because of the subject matter of my dissertation, which was on ear surgery for deafness in the 19th century, I was also drawing in readers who were deaf. And one of my most viral posts was actually a history of the London Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, which was one of the first public deaf schools in England. And then actually by 2014 was still very much in existence as a primary school for deaf children. So this post went viral, and I even had parents reaching out to me asking if I could help them get their kid enrolled in this school. And I had to explain so many times I have nothing to do with the school. I'm just an historian. But I started to notice my audience changing a little bit and started to write posts that were specifically catered to the general reader. Hearing happiness comes from that history, not from my dissertation. And it comes from the recognition, I think, that there was an audience of people who were interested in knowing more, not just about the history of deafness, but also about the choices people made for medical treatment. And the big question of why were people so willing, I think, to try out what we would consider to be quack medicine. So what really is that history there? So I kind of, when I first pitched my book to different presses, I pitched it as, this extension of my blog. So I think that also helped me to play around with my narrative style a little bit, not just restrict myself in writing academically.
Yeah. I mean, the style is wonderful throughout the book, Jay. And was it a time where presses found that extension of the blog interesting, or was there some disdain? How did that conversation go?
I don't do things in a conventional manner. So, I mean, I think about like my colleagues who write the whole book manuscript and then pitch the manuscript to presses, or people who have like a full book proposal and shop around for press. I basically had a paragraph that was something along the line of, "This is a cool idea for a book. Are you interested in publishing it?" And send it to 3 different presses to see which one would bite. I mean, it was just, honestly, at that time, I wasn't really thinking about a career in academia. This wasn't my quote unquote tenure book or anything. I just thought, this is a book that needs to be written and published. And at the time when I wrote that paragraph pitch, I haven't done research. I haven't been in the archive. I have no idea what this book was going to look like. I didn't even really have a title. I just had an idea and I just took the leap and pitched it. But what we have to remember too is that presses are businesses. And one way to sell any book is to ensure that there is an audience who is willing to buy those books. And when I pitched my idea for a book, I had about, I think, 12,000 followers / subscribers for my blog. And for the press, that's like, oh, that 12,000 people who could possibly buy your book. So was that was the extension, so to speak. It was like, I already have a readership base here. So all that I really have to do is transfer that readership base from the blog over to the book.
Right on. You begin the book mostly in the 19th century with kind of occasional looks back. And by today's standards, as you've already said, a lot of the things you cover are kind of quackish cures in quotation marks, including breathing into the ear, eating chili peppers, perforating the eardrum. Why did you choose to begin the book there in the 19th century? Was there something that really stood out about that moment when it came to deafness?
That's a good question. For me, it came out from my PhD dissertation, and that this whole medicalization of deafness, this whole approach to surgical treatments actually really did emerge in the 19th century. Before that, there were medical attempts to treat deafness, but they
Mm.
weren't actually grouped in a professional manner. It was more like this trial and error process. But by 1850s, you see the emergence of oral surgery, which we now call otolaryngology. It emerged as a specialized field specifically for thinking about how to diagnose, prescribe, and treat all kinds of deafness. So I decided to start there because when we think about deafness cure, like what does that really mean? It's really about like fixing the body, restoring the body back to quote unquote normal. So for me, the 19th century seemed like a logical place to start, but that doesn't mean,
Mhm.
of course, that there weren't any kind of cures before that. As you said, I do
Yeah.
reflect even earlier, but
Mhm.
I really wanted to centralize the medicalization narrative because that was also part of the more longer argument that I was making throughout the book, that really connecting medicalization with normality and how technology kind of fits in that relationship.
Mhm. Your second chapter is titled Ear Spectacles, which is a title I really love. And you find a whole range of mechanical and other contraptions that people
Mhm,
are putting forward for to cure deafness, again, in cure in quotation marks. But I mean, I think that this is like, it was dizzying. I think, you talk about how confusing it can be for consumers,
mhm,
later. For me, the sheer variety was overwhelming, really. So, I mean, what did you find most striking about all of these contraptions that were being put forward?
mhm. Yeah, a lot of reviewers have used that phrase, dizzying away of example, like almost kind of repetitive. And I always reply back, but that's the point. Why were there
Yes.
so many, right? Like, why? And it shocked me too when I'm
Yeah.
in the museum warehouse, they're looking at some of these examples in the archive. And I actually had like a little database where I was keeping track of every single contraption that I came across that referred to cure for deafness or help with hearing loss or anything
Mm.
like that. There were so many. And it seems almost ridiculous. Like, why are they all like fighting for the same market? And
Yeah.
why were deaf people even seeing that as an option when we think about the dangers of sending electrical surges directly to your ears, or even believing that radium or vibration, if you put them in your ear long enough, would miraculously cure your deafness. But I think there was something, what I saw when I was doing this research was that this kind of trust in the
Mm.
technology, this expectation that you have the material thing, whether it is a box that stands electric shocks or a tiny artificial eardrum that you put in your ear. There is this trust that this is an improved, advanced piece of machinery that could actually help, and
Yeah.
perhaps a more what's the word, more advanced than just trying like a folk remedy or any kind of herbal medicine. So I
Yeah.
think that's one reason, but we also have to take into consideration the legislation changes around patent medicine that emerged in the 20th century. So with the passing of the Food and Drug Act in 1906, all kinds of patent medicine that was basically like oil-based or other kind of like pharmaceutical grade type of medicine, they were regulated under the original FDA Act. Under the FDA, but the mechanical therapy was then.
Mhm.
So all kind of electrical products that were promoted to be, electrotherapeutic devices, whether it's handheld vibrators or again big boxes that send electric surges to the ear, those weren't covered. So they actually were a much better money-making stream than patent
Mm.
medicine. So which is why in the early 20th century we see so many of that until 1938 when the FDA cracked down on these kinds of electric devices. And what's also interesting, I know from the chapter, is that even hearing aid companies relied on these kinds of electric devices too. So
Yeah.
they're selling hearing aids as the new advanced technology, as an assistive technology, but knowing that their customers were often frustrated with the lack of a permanent cure, They also offered, and sometimes at discounted prices, handheld vibrators or massagers or other kind of quackish electrotherapy, so the customers could at least feel secure, possibly, that they were trying everything at their disposal to cure the hearing. Sorry, to cure their deafness.
And I think this is the story of like too much variety. Maybe is something we see in other histories of technology. I'm primarily familiar with it in the early history of the automobile, where people had to choose between early batteries, steam-driven cars, all kinds of internal combustion engines. There's just so much variety that it seems dizzying. I know it's often hard to reconstruct what, the average deaf person's experiencing during that time. But do you think it felt like, oh, there's 10 or 20 or a bunch of things on offer, and you're trying to negotiate that as a deaf person?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the greatest strengths I had as a historian working in the archives is that the American Medical Association had thousands of letters written by deaf people all across America, because what they were doing was they were reaching out to Arthur Cramp, who was the director of the Bureau of Investigation, the agency that looked at the validity of all kinds of medical therapies and gizmos and gadgets and patent medicine. So these letters really reveal how people were struggling with their options. I mean, there are some letters that are basically just a page of people listing all the different things that they tried, or listing the things that they saw were available on the market and asking for advice about how to choose amongst them. I mean, so many times I've read a letter written by a deaf person saying they're overwhelmed with their choices and they don't know how to pick which one is the best for their type of hearing loss, and their personal physicians aren't really helpful either. So they need somebody who's an expert in these technologies. But I see this over and over again in their letters. Now, what good is the choice here? The variety was really because the manufacturers and the innovators and the entrepreneurs are all trying to make a living. But if you think about it from the perspective of the deaf customer, this was overwhelming. Like, it was really difficult to select which one was not only the best treatment, but also which one they could justify spending money on. And I think really see this coming out more clearly, especially when I started to look at the letter during the Depression years. I see people trying to decide, well, I only have $5. Which one do I pick for this $5? And I need a hearing device because I can get a job, or I need one for work, or etc. But the choices of possibilities, I think, really did overwhelm the deaf customer.
Yeah, contrary to some schools of economics, the market doesn't just automatically spit out like what the best option is, right? It's not clear.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely not clear. Yeah.
The creation of the electric hearing aid seems like a major turning point in this story. So what did the hearing aid mean to deaf people when it was first introduced? And did it just seem like another one of these gizmos out there, or was there something different about it?
There was definitely something different. So in 1898, Miller Reese Hutchinson introduced his Aculion, which was their basically a desktop hearing aid. So all the components were in a box that had to be placed flat on a table, and then a deaf person would wear headphones and listen. When he took this machine out on tour, he would go to deaf social groups and organizations and even deaf conferences and kind of give a demonstration. You see, I think, a mix of excitement but also fear. People who were being interviewed by reporters or who were documenting their experience at the demonstration. The excitement was, oh my goodness, I could hear sound. Oh, I think I hear something. And Hutchinson was actually demonstrating to predominantly culturally deaf people. So people who grew up with sign language or part of hereditary deafness families, or who went to deaf school. And I think that was really smart on his part, because if we think about the extreme of our customer bases, these were that people who have never heard sound would be like one extreme of a customer. And if they could hear sounds, then that's really powerful testament to his device. So, but the problem was that as these deaf people were trying out his like Hutchinson instrument, they're not sure what they are hearing. Sorry,
Yeah.
Lee, you just completely froze. You were very, very still. No,
Oh,
I
no,
need
no.
more people.
I'm paying it. I'm rapt attention over here. I'm paying attention to
Okay,
every
okay,
word.
okay. No, it's okay. I'll start over. But so like the people, when they were trying out the device during the demonstration, there was this sense of fear because they didn't really know for certain what they were hearing was actually sound, or they were
Yeah.
being fooled to hearing sound. And this is
Mm,
something that they expressed in a newspaper that was circulated among deaf
mm-hmm.
people, or they testified that to reporters. But there's also this excitement, I think, about the wonders of electricity. I mean, this is like, again,
Yes,
late
right.
19th century, where people are starting to both be fearful and excited about
Yeah.
the potential of electricity to
Mm,
modernize society. So there was this excitement that perhaps now we're going to find a technology that can really help deaf people. I mean, the
yeah.
telephone was already like starting to become popular. You have the wireless and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So why not develop a hearing aid as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, there's also all kinds of quackish things going on with electricity during that time, right? They're like pumping it into the ground with crops to
Mm-hmm.
try to make crops grow faster. So, I mean, it
Yep.
would have been confusing then about whether this was really promising or not.
Yeah, I think so. But then again, it's really about, I think, the expectation of being normal. If there's
Yeah.
a technology that's available for deaf people to passive hearing, or even better, to permanently restore the hearing and permanently cure deafness, then why not try it out? So I think
Yeah.
this is the messages that were coming out with some of the early 20th century hearing aids, is that we
Mm.
we have harnessed the wonder of electricity to create a
Yes.
product, and it can do for deaf people what nothing in the previous generation has ever done.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think the building up of these kind of quackish products as well was really centering on that rhetoric. Like, deaf
Yeah.
people, do you want to hear? Who's
Yeah.
gonna say
Yeah.
no to that? And I think that's the kind of messaging that was being developed at the time.
Mm-hmm. Some of your more recent research examines how hearing aid companies are tried to form relationships with deaf and hard of hearing folks via salespeople.
Mhm.
This is a paper you gave last week at a conference. So, what have you been finding in your work on the history of hearing aid fitting, and how does that fit with the story you've been telling?
Well, one thing I didn't really go into detail in hearing happiness, because it didn't really fit with the overall thesis of the book, was how did the hearing aid companies not just work with deaf people, but how did deaf people reflect back to them?
Mm-hmm.
So I was really curious about, for one thing, you have all these advertising promotional campaigns relaying the messaging about normality to deaf people, like putting that idea that wearing a hearing aid is a deaf person's social responsibility. The same way, you have to get a job and pay taxes and send your kids to
Yeah.
school and get vaccinated and all of that. You wear a hearing
Mm-hmm.
aid. And this was the message that dominated hearing aid advertising for most of the 20th century. But when I look at archive material of deaf people talking about the choices of hearing aids or other kind of quackish medical products or patty medicine, I was really trying to also find, well, what did they think about these advertising messages?
Mm-hmm.
How did it influence their decision to, feel pressure to uphold their social responsibility, or decide whether or not they wanted to be deaf and communicate with sign language or not, or like I
Mm.
was really curious about really looking at the history from the deaf person perspective, and this was something that was really challenging to find in the
Mm.
archive, because it really tells us about how we preserve history and whose stories get maintained. But one thing that really became clear is the hearing aid dealer, so the salesman who did direct selling directly to the customer,
Yeah.
they were the ones who were essentially taking the messaging back and forth between the customers and the industry. So now keep in mind that deaf and hard of hearing people did collaborate with the hearing aid industry. Mara Mill's work, for
Sure.
example, had shown that deaf people were working as testers and engineers for the creation of things like the printed circuit and the transistor. So Mara had done incredible work on that. But I was really more concerned about the consumer angle as well. And what became really revealing is I was at the archive looking at all these trade manuals for dealers and these
Yeah.
training books that also included step-by-step details on how a dealer should appeal to the emotional state of the customer. And some of the dealers were like making comments like, oh, this 40-year-old woman, her major concern is being able to hear her baby. And she doesn't really want to wear a hearing aid because the wires complicate her domestic duties. Like they're putting all these like
Yeah.
annotations. And for me, the more I look into it, the more it seems it's evident that the dealers were also communicating what their client's concern was back to the industry, and the industry was kind of embracing some of these notes as a way to update the advertising material or update the marketing strategy. So I thought it was really
Yeah.
fascinating. I mean, this really goes into um, a much longer term project. But out of that relationship is the issue of fitting. So
Yeah.
fitting is a process where you have to match a particular hearing aid instrument to the range of hearing loss that's mapped on an audiogram. So you get tested for your hearing loss and then you measure what that loss is and a range of frequencies. And a good hearing aid is one that targets a specific frequency loss, especially the loss where speech is measured so that a person could be able to hear like vowels and consonants and things like that. And fitting was always a process for vacuum tube hearing aids. I mean, the industry knew that. This is how the engineers and design created it. But how do you sell fitting to a customer? And why should a customer care about fitting? And that's the different conversation. And what the dealer was doing is that fitting was a demonstration of not just how a hearing aid was working and how effective it was, but on how it was tailored to match this specific individual's needs. So there's something like really personal about the technology. And the process of improving the technical specification of fitting is one history, a very difficult history, because in order to proceed with it, I have to like teach myself acoustic physics.
Yeah. Right.
Like the technical nature of physics and sound science and things like that.
Yeah.
And then you have this marketing history about, is that just a buzzword? Like when we say individualized fitting, is that just a campaign or is that something really rooted in science and technology? So that's kind of what I'm working on right now. I'm really interested in seeing how fitting became a process that operated both at the scientific level, but also on the consumer level, and how we can kind of understand the nature of technology through this relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it comes out in your book in a variety of ways, but one thing I like about this thread is that it's an ongoing relationship. It's not just like my amputee friends who keep needing to get
Absolutely.
prosthetics replaced and such. This is not something that you just buy and then your problems are fixed and you walk away forever, right? So yeah, I really like that kind of ongoing relationship story is an important one.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, it also kind of explains some of the more popular conversation that people have had. At first, they were like, well, hearing aids are just like getting glasses. If you can wear glasses, why can't you wear a hearing aid? And then the argument over the 20th century developed into, well, hearing aids are not like eyeglasses. They are much more sophisticated than that. We need all these body of experts to come in to properly fit a hearing aid to the deaf customer.
Yeah. Your book contains so many wonderful photos, and one of the most striking to my eye is the picture meant to show women how to do their hair and use accessories to hide their hearing aids. So as hearing aids, they become electronic and then, they become smaller. What did the promise of invisibility mean to users?
Well, invincibility has always been a selling point for all kinds of hearing devices, from mechanical ear trumpets in the 19th century that were disguised to be worn in a woman's bouffant hairdo, or if some of them I've seen actually even concealed in a man's heavy bushy beard, or, or disguised as walking sticks or flower vases.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the early 20th century with vacuum tube hearing aids, invincibility was about disguising the wires and battery straps and the actual receiver on your body, and like wearing it underneath your clothes, making use
Mm.
of special harnesses. And then the post Second World War technological development with the transistor, button battery, the printed circuit allowed hearing aids to become smaller and smaller. So the box type hearing aids, so the one you wear in your body, not only started to get smaller, so all the component pieces are in one unit
Mm.
essentially, but also eventually they became smaller so that they're worn either behind your ear or in your ear.
Mm.
So with this history of miniaturization, you also get the design trends toward invincibility. How do we continue to disguise the device on your body,
Yeah.
even going so far as to hide it in your hair? And all kinds of hearing companies, actually, I think every single hearing aid company advise their consumers on how to disguise their products
Mm.
and or buy other kinds of accessories to help with that disguising.
Mm-hmm.
What I find fascinating, and this is also a project that I'm working on now, and something I'm very, very excited about, is if we look into the material culture of these hearing aids, so if we actually look at the products themselves, how they're designed, we get a real strong sense of aesthetics. So there are body worn hearing aids that are painted blue or have gold or decal microphone grills. And my concern, no, sorry, and my thinking is basically, if these devices are meant to be hidden, then what's the point of all this design?
Yeah.
So why not just make them boring, ugly medical products, or splash on that flesh colored,
Mm.
um, sorry, or splash on that flesh colored, paint? Why
Yeah.
bother with creating gold or silver, or bother with these kind of decorative
Mm-hmm.
elements? And it seems to me that, well, these are features that appeal to the customer. Like
Mm.
they will pick a woman, for example, would pick a color that fit her own fashion or individual
Yeah.
style. Maybe a man would want something that's more sleek and modern. So I mean, they're really to appeal to the customer. And then paradoxically say, okay, you pick something that's beautiful and gold. Okay, now hide it.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, well, what's the point,
Right.
right?
Right.
And in the backdrop of this history is that people making their own adjustment. They
Mm.
are putting decorative features on their devices. They are creating beautiful harnesses
Yeah.
with hand sewn beads to, like really professing a sense of identity and affirmation of their
Mm.
deafness. They
Mm-hmm.
are showing off their products. So you get this overlapping histories occurring at the same time. And I'm really excited about this project because I think it can really tell us so much more about design history and the expectation we have or don't have about medical products, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, lest we give listeners like the sense that this is a story of progress, it's
Mhm.
not like quackery or fad cures like
Mhm.
go away after the 19th century, early 20th century, right?
Mhm.
There's still you have a chapter on later kind of fad cures. So, what are some of the cures you find after World War II that people are trying to push?
So one common fad after the Second World War was what's the word? Acupuncture.
Oh yeah,
So it really come up. I mean, people were starting to embrace that like Eastern medicine,
yeah,
holistic, new age type of philosophy.
uh-huh,
And acupuncture become really common starting around the 1960s. And another one that still to today, I'm still surprised, but not really surprised when I see it on the menu list for spa treatment is ear candling.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? Like when people like basically put hot wax in your ear and then pull out um I don't know, debris and natural wax and things like that. I mean,
Yeah.
candling dates all the way back to the 16th century. I mean, that's the oldest example I found, but it is still there. There's also like I've seen what I call fake hearing aids.
Mm.
So like if you go to Walgreens, for example, there's that as seen on TV
Yeah.
1995
Yeah.
hearing aid, very basic and doesn't really do anything for someone otherwise, like who had anything more than a mild temporary hearing loss.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
No, I think these are the most prominent examples I can think of, but they're definitely there. Like these kind of
Yeah.
treatments are still there, and there's also um if we do a quick internet search, I'm sure you'll find examples of like certain foods that could help improve your hearing.
Oh
And that's,
yeah. Uh-huh.
like, yeah.
Yes. The internet, the source of bad information over and over, right? Yeah. We'll Google deafness cure and see what comes up. It'll be
Yeah.
horrifying, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
I really like how you bring in the history of cochlear implants into this larger history you tell. So do you think that cochlear implants introduced new dynamics, or did you see it more as kind of the playing out of the patterns that you'd uncovered from the last 150 years?
I think both in their creation and in their dissemination as a technology cure, it's the same pattern.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more assertive, I would say.
Yeah.
It's the merging of surgery and technology.
Mm.
And I think when it was like so, let me start over. And when cochlear implants were first introduced, it was promised the new miracle that
Yeah.
would solve all the kind of complications people were having with hearing aids or other kind of surgical treatments. Like
Yeah.
issues of battery life or wires being annoying or not being fitted properly with
Yep.
regard to hearing aids. But also this idea that there is a subsection of so I mean, if you think about hearing as an audiological spectrum, you can also think
Mm-hmm.
about deafness as a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum are people whose deafness can be fixed or improved with hearing aid. Cochlear implant target those group.
Yeah.
And again, it comes with this idea of a fix.
Yes.
So you can live your whole life as a deaf person. You can rely on sign language. You can get a job. You can be an educator. You can have a family. But as long as you are deaf, you are not fixed. And that's the messaging that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s with
Mm.
cochlear implants. And the deaf communities were really worried about cultural genocide. What would
Mm.
happen over decades and decades of use with cochlear implants where children as young as 1 or 2 years old are forced to um, undergo surgery and be fitted with an implant. And there's also this recognition that a lot of deaf children are actually born into hearing family who might
Mm.
not otherwise be associating themselves or even familiar with deaf culture. So there was this real worry from deaf community that cochlear implant would eradicate deafness as this rich cultural diversity. But by, the early 2000s, the conversation shifted a little bit, where it's really, again, about choice. You make that choice about how you want to
Mm.
live. And part of that choice is selecting amongst different types of technologies or tools or treatments that are at your disposal. And
Yeah.
again, this is not something new. And if we look at all the different ways that people have negotiated their medical option, we see cochlear implant as just another line of these tools.
Yeah.
So, but I think in the 1990s and early 2000s, the worry was really about the top-down pressure
Mm.
to eliminate differences. And I see in the past 10 years the next generation of cochlear implants, and we're talking about like auditory brainstem implants and things
Yeah.
like that. And interestingly enough, right when my book was finished and I sent it to the publisher, and I'm in Virginia giving my first book event, and my phone started buzzing because the story about CRISPR technology
Oh yeah.
broke out, and I'm getting all this like messaging from reporters
Yeah.
asking me to comment, and I said I can't. I'm giving my Facebook talk. This is just another example of that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I actually opened up my talk reflecting on the fact that look how many messages I got from journalists, all
Yeah.
connecting this idea of CRISPR technology as the way to eliminate deafness. It's just another example.
Mm.
So, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, no, that you went exactly where I wanted to go, because I think part of what you end up uncovering and you deal with really explicitly in that last chapter is this kind of fantasy of the radically transformed tomorrow, right? That's always seems
Yes,
to be with us around so many issues, but deafness is a wonderful example, as if it's like tomorrow there will be CRISPR or tomorrow there'll be this thing, and it's just
absolutely.
going to
Yes.
take care of it for us, right?
Yes. The reliance we have, I think, on this technology, but in expecting technology to solve all the problem, I think we only end up revealing socioeconomic disparity there. When
Yeah.
people talk about digital hearing aids, as something that we must have, there's not a real honest conversation, I think,
Mm.
about the cost of these things. I mean, when my audiologist is telling me, Jay, you're behind the curve, like catch up with the latest trend,
Yeah.
why are you being old fashioned? Just get digital hearing aids. I'm like, but I spent my whole life training myself to live and hear with analog hearing aids. Like literally my
Mm.
whole life. I learned how to use my body language. I taught myself how to hear on the telephone. And now you're telling me none of that matters because I have to like
Mm.
upgrade myself, like the weird like I'm a cyborg model that was outdated and we have to like ship to the new factory version.
Yeah, yeah.
But with
New
digital
J.
hearing, it's so expensive.
Yeah.
And not only that, they have a shelf life. My last
Mm.
analog hearing aid, I had them for 12 years with maintaining and repairing and just keeping it going as
Yeah.
long as I could, or sending it off to the factory to get repaired if needed. My last digital hearing aid didn't even last 3 years. And there was
Oh.
a point where I was actually like trying to fix it and went to my hearing aid dealer and I said, what's happening? Like, why is it no longer working? And by the way, keep in mind, it took me 2 years to get adjusted to them. And in the third year, they stopped working. Like, what's the point of this? And it was really frustrating for me. It's like, I can't rely on this anymore. And then
Yeah.
I hate when people promote hearing aids to me by showing off how they have a smartphone app. I don't care about the
Yeah. Right.
smartphone app.
Yeah.
What if I don't
Yeah.
have my phone with me? Are you telling me I can't adjust my hearing aid if I don't have my phone? So
Mm.
there is this over reliance on smart technology to solve problems.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we forget that not everybody benefits from these devices. I mean, don't get
Yeah.
me wrong. When I first got my digital hearing aid, I was wowed by how light they were, how tiny they were, how I got the color to match my hair color, because it was something I never had before.
Mhm.
And I thought about what this would mean for my passing and hearing, how it would work out in, my job or things like that, how it would change my dating relationship. Like I was really thinking about that and excited about it.
Mhm.
But again, within 2 years of struggling with this, it didn't matter how invincible they were. There was no point if they weren't functional for me.
Yeah.
I couldn't hear anything. And, when I had to upgrade myself and spend, by the way, another $8,000 to 3
Oh!
years later, right, to
Oh!
get hearing aids, um, my first thought was, I don't care how they look. I just want them to work. I need them to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
The ones I have aren't the prettiest. They are bulky. They hurt my ears when I wear them for too long. But
Yeah.
at the very least, they're functional enough that I can go about somewhat in the same vein as I could with my analog hearing aid. But again, there's this expectation that technology is going to solve our problem, but sometimes it
Mm.
doesn't, and it makes things a lot worse. And when we think
Yeah.
about assistive technology and acknowledge the fact that so much of assistive technology relies on an intimate relationship between the user and the machine, we have to take into consideration the user's needs because the user is always going to have to adjust in some way to the
Mm.
technology. And if the technology is not adaptable, then this is not a good relationship.
Yeah. No, I think there's so many lessons for designers and makers of technologies to take away from this book. I mean, the innovation delusion book, when I was writing that with Andy, we got an email from this one very cranky repairman. I can't remember what we said. He was angry at us about something, but he was talking about how in his life, he was an appliance repair guy, and he was talking about like how refrigerators now all had to come with ice makers and stuff, but those are the first things to break down. And and then we have like the same thing, you put like a Bluetooth thing on a coffee maker or something, because you got to have Bluetooth on everything now. And these are often the first things to go. So I mean, we just like, it's like this logic where we have to add all the bells and whistles, and now your hearing aids have to have an app, and that's going to be super cool. So I mean, there is kind of lessons to be taken from like these technological fads and how they actually, in some ways they become a detriment to users, I think.
Oh, of course. I mean, and they were exactly that. They were technological fad. The first time I was shopping for a digital hearing aid, the audiologist is like saying, "Oh, Jay, this one, allows you to connect to your iPod. This one gives you Wi-Fi capabilities." Not once the conversation about which one allows me to hear clearly came
Yeah.
up. I don't care about these bells and whistles. And at the end of the day, it's really about, well, what do I want a hearing aid to do? And Bluetooth is nice sometimes because I can blast music on my iPad and my partner is not bothered. So that's great.
Yeah.
But it's not the end of the world for me if I don't have that feature anymore.
Yeah.
For me, if I'm not able to, let's say, hear my students in a lecture hall, then I can't do my job. And
Yeah.
that's the problem. And that actually happened because when I first had my first pair of digital hearing aids, I went to the classroom. I couldn't hear. I had 9 students. I couldn't hear any of them in front of me. I had to rely on lip reading, which is something I hadn't done in the classroom in years. But I couldn't hear the 9 students in front of me, but the conversation outside closed doors in the hallway, I could hear clear as day. I could hear somebody chatting away on their cell phone, but not the 9 students in front of me. And,
Wow.
again, that's why it took 2 years for me to adjust to that. But it's really something about, again, we talk about improved technology, we jump into the latest technological fad, but what's the point if they don't really benefit people?
Yeah. I wanted to ask about like kind of where you're thinking, because the book is such a personal story on top of being a history, and I think it does a great job of interweaving these two things. But I think it's pretty common for hearing people to presume that deafness is something that we would want to cure, in quotation marks, right? Which is not to say that's the right view, and often it's not. But after writing Hearing Happiness, what do you think is a better way of thinking about deafness and hearing problems than this cure notion? Like how do we trouble that cure notion? And is there like a better framework for people to think
I
about?
think the answer I usually give to that question, which I get quite often, like how do we rethink our understanding of hearing and deafness? Again, it goes back to, well, think of deafness as an audiological spectrum. And people have different types of deafness and different ways of developing their identities or affirming that identity, but also different ways and living with their
Yeah.
deafness. Some might want a hearing aid and they might want to pass with hearing and they want that cure. Others might prefer sign language communication, and others still might wear hearing aids and communicate just fine with lip reading. There are people who would want closed captioning and others don't. So it's a very individual experience, and disability activists always tell us, and I know I follow their lead for a lot of things related to disability activism, and they say that if you really want to know about what technology interface is useful, for example, ask the person.
Yeah.
That like make it an ordinary thing to ask people what their access needs are, or the same way we are trying to better ourselves and acknowledging people pronoun. or people pronunciation of their names. So make that an ordinary aspect of our relationship to each other and how we communicate as a community. Then we can acknowledge how, deafness and hearing is also on a spectrum. But there's still a problem here in that I think generally there's this cultural belief that a cultural belief to infantilize deaf people and that we need hearing people to speak for them. There is this controversy going on right now on Twitter. That movie Sound of, what's it called? The Sound of Metal? I think it's called Sound of Metal. It's the movie starring a brown actor, so a Muslim actor. And it's the story is about a drummer who starts to lose his hearing and has to like adjust his whole life and expectation to being deaf, including learning sign language. And the actor is a hearing person, and that would already create a problem for deaf people because they're like, well, why not just cast a deaf actor who can play the character with much more nuance? But what's been happening right now is that actor and the movie was nominated for an Emmy, and I think it's nominated for an Oscar now. And in the whole press tour, the actor is talking about how he benefited from conversation with the deaf community and he learned sign language, but none of the promotional materials are captioned. And no ASL interpreter, right? So you're like, it's like, what? You really didn't learn anything at all. And even if that promotional material is not the responsibility of the actor himself, it's still something that he can use his position to advocate for. But also, why not bring somebody from the deaf community to also have this conversation alongside the actor? It would be much more powerful. So a lot of I've seen a lot of deaf activists kind of pushing back against this narrative because they're like, well, again, it's hearing people speaking for us. Why can't we tell our own story? And I think going back to hearing happiness, I think that's also why people resonated so well to me putting my personal stories in there. It's not just that I have this authority coming in as an historian, but I'm also somebody who lived through and is living through some of these issues that I talk about in this book. And that provides an insight or credibility that I think, hearing people might not have in writing the book.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if I hear you, one way to put it, and I'm just kind of like trying to echo back what I hear is, your book is about all these options that people face, but so often all those options are converging on a norm, which is the person being like the normal person, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And what you're trying, part of what you're saying is that that's not the way it's going to play out. People are going to make all kinds of different decisions and end up in all kinds of different places. There is no place we can converge. And so then what we have to do is kind of attend to them as individuals where they're at, right?
Yes, exactly, yeah. And recognize the variability of their choices. So it's not that like one choice is better than the other. It's just they're just choices.
Yeah.
I mean, like I'm a deaf person. I mean, I have like 98, 99% hearing loss. I'm a perfect candidate for cochlear implant, but I wear hearing aids because that's what I've worn my whole life. And that's what I have been adjusted to. But I'm also someone who relies heavily on lip reading. I don't sign because I don't have a signing community around me, and I never really did. But people make that assumption about me, oh, Jay might sign, so we have to get an ASL interpreter. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really help me because I'm not fluent in ASL. So I'm going to have, translation issues here. And also, like, I think about audiologists who read my chart and say, why don't you have a cochlear implant? You're a perfect candidate. I'm like, well, why don't you go have brain surgery? Like, are you comfortable making that decision? Like, what's wrong with the choice I have made when it's working just fine with my day-to-day life? So, it's that prescriptive force, I think, that bothers me so much.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple different threads of your current research and where it's headed. How do you frame the next thing you're up to? What's Jay up to next?
Well, I'm doing many different things. But I think to summarize basically everything I'm doing is my current and future research all looks at the development of technology, the development of the development of technology, the development of medical expertise from the perspective of the people.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are the bottom of all these top-down push for normality cures, I want to see how they respond. I want to see what kind of non-conventional, non-conformative solutions they come up with. I want to see where radical design emerges from that. And, I talked very briefly about the people making harnesses or improving the design of their hearing aids. I think it is so fascinating to see this tinkering coming out of the user, because I'm wondering if it makes a shift our understanding about how we develop technology. And we can talk about disabled people working in collaboration with engineers and designers and development, but what if there's a resistance to that?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm looking at now. I have a piece coming out in a few months about the beauty of hearing aids,
Mm-hmm.
kind of tying in some of these ideas about design and what it means on one hand to design the actual hearing aid, for color or style, and
Yeah.
how that differs a more radical perspective where you, like, I don't know, bedazzle your hearing
Yeah.
aid, right?
Right.
Which people have done. I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of do-it-yourself instruction manuals on the internet about how you can, like, add charms or paint your hearing aid or things like that.
Yeah. Right.
So I think it's really a fascinating history here.
Yeah. Jay, thank you so much for your time today. It's wonderful talking to you as always, and I'm really excited about this new work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again for having me. And, I can talk all day about this kind of stuff. So I think we should stop. Yeah.
Thanks again, Jay.
Okay.